And this is frightening because it isn't possible for us to control those things once chemicals are already at large in our environment.
Welcome to the Be Well podcast, wellness backed by science, bringing you inspiring conversations to help you on your wellness journey to a healthier, happier you. Brought to you by Breast Cancer UK. You can start your personal prevention journey right now by taking our prevention quiz. Just click on the link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to the Be Well podcast. I'm Thalie Martini, CEO of Breast Cancer UK. And today we turn our attention to an intriguing, much discussed and also very debated and widely experienced time in life. We describe it with a very simple word, but it can provoke very powerful and varied responses. And the word is motherhood. And it's a topic beautifully covered by my guest today in her book, Mother Animal, which tells a fascinating parallel story of her personal discovery of her own motherhood, but alongside that, a rather scientific discovery of how other species of animals approach motherhood. There's lots of wow moments in this book, and I've really enjoyed reading it. And what this book does is it really helps compel us to reject the idea of motherhood as a mere passive act, and actually to look beyond our own experience as humans and try to understand motherhood through the extraordinary ways in which other species have adapted this all-important task of bringing new life into this world. So yes, there are many themes addressed in this book, many of which are really relevant to us at Breast Cancer UK, and I'm really looking forward to covering all of that in our conversation. But there is one area that's really discussed a lot in here, and that's breastfeeding and its benefits to mothers in particular. As just from a statistical point of view, we know that for every 12 months of breastfeeding, breast cancer risk is reduced by about 4%. So that's something of real interest to us. But also, this book goes a lot further, and it covers another really important area that we are concerned about at Breast Cancer UK also, and that's how exposure to harmful chemicals such as endocrine disrupting chemicals, otherwise known as EDCs, during critical periods of our life, such as in the womb or in early childhood, this can also impact on our health as well as our breast cancer risk. Now, it's a really challenging topic, and I'm really quite enamored at how well covered it is in here, because my guest really discusses this with eloquence, dignity, and a huge amount of insight. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And it's about time I introduce my guest. I'm really pleased to welcome Helen Jukes to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming along today.
And thank you for a beautiful introduction. That was really lovely.
You know, as you can see from all the tears and the amount of time I've spent with this book, that I'm really interested in this conversation. So let's talk about your book, Mother Animal. It examines all these forms of motherhood across the animal kingdom. From the fish, from mammals, birds, reptiles. You even go into great detail about certain insects. And gosh, I learned so much. I actually, was thinking, how, when you're going through this incredible process yourself, do you have time to think about this? I thought this was fascinating. But what was it that inspired you to write this book and also to talk about your experience of motherhood?
Yeah, I think a book often begins for me when I'm experiencing some kind of dissonance or some kind of puzzle that I feel like I want to explore and get to the bottom of. And I think that pregnancy for me was a time of real dissonance, where I realised that I was quite soon into the experience. I realised that my felt experience of pregnancy diverged from the image that I realised I'd absorbed from the wider culture about what motherhood and especially pregnancy was going to be like. So I'd always imagined it as this time of kind of tranquility and calm. And actually, I was so tired all of the time. The first trimester, I was mostly in bed with kind of 24-hour nausea. And it was also, for me, a very strange experience, and one that wasn't, I'd kind of imagined that pregnancy would just be kind of limited to my womb, and it would take 9 months, and at the end of 9 months a baby would come out. And actually it was a really whole body, mind, self experience. And I guess I began becoming interested in this image that we have of this kind of tranquil, calm, benevolent, self-sacrificing mother, and started kind of, I don't know, I guess kind of wanting to investigate where that image comes from and why it has so much traction. And I also realised that often nature and ideas of naturalness are strong signifiers when we think of motherhood. So we think of it as this time of kind of naturalness, and I started to wonder, well, what does motherhood actually look like in the natural world, and what is it like for other species? And so I began reading about pregnancy, birth, lactation, parenting in other species, and it was like lifting a lid. And very quickly I realised that actually in the animal kingdom, motherhood is a far more diverse and strange and fluxy and changeable experience than I had ever imagined. And in a way that helped me to, I think that really helped me to process my own experience, and kind of made it possible for me to feel more of the feelings that I was experiencing. And so the book became a kind of dialogue, I suppose, between the reading that I was doing and all of these other animals that I was encountering, and then my own kind of growing experiences of what it was like to bring another being into the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly how I encountered. I was initially surprised that you were exploring, I suppose, these other experiences that were so different to our own, but just by virtue of exploring them, as you say, it brought about that understanding of what does nature actually mean?
Yeah.
And did it help you kind of challenge this idea of mothers as passive?
As soon as we begin to look at many of these processes of motherhood, that pregnancy or birth or lactation, the idea that the mother exists as this kind of passive animal immediately dissipates, because, for example, pregnancy is one of the most resource heavy things that a human can do. And in the animal world too, it's this far more complex process than I'd ever understood. So bears, for example, are able to suspend or abort pregnancies, so there are all of these far more kind of complex processes for mothers, and to think of infant feeding as well. I looked at, for example, the thorn treehopper is this tiny insect that slices spiral slits into plant stems to expose the phloem tubes inside that then they feed to their offspring. Or pandas will feed their cubs with their own feces, which contains enzymes which helps their cubs to metabolize bamboo when they move on to solid foods. So there are these kind of very intricate systems that mothers have involved in relation to their wider environment and in relation to their offspring. And it really, I kind of had to let go of this idea that the mother was this passive being. She's not. She's complex and she's strange and fascinating.
Yeah, and I think we followed that kind of transformative thought process in this book, and the more, and you feel like you're making that discovery along with you, but the more you're making those discoveries, the more your kind of Google searches about what's safe for your baby, that kind of started taking you down this rabbit hole.
Yeah,
and we tumble down with you, looking at terrifying toxicology reports, and you conjure up scary image of mothers being invaded, the stuff of human industry making its way into the breast milk, amniotic fluid, bones. There's a kind of a gear change at one point where you start to highlight an interesting contradiction, and that's that although there's all this resilience that we see both in nature, in other species and in humans, this resilience, this adaptability of mothers, but they're also really vulnerable. So what is it that you discovered about this particular life window that's so critical when it comes to all these things in our environment that we're exposed to that makes us vulnerable?
Yeah, so it was really, you asked right at the start about how the research happened, and really it happened in a very slipshod, chaotic kind of way initially. And it wasn't until much later that I started looking into any of these things in depth when my daughter was older. But I did, and I had one particular day when I was breastfeeding and scrolling absentmindedly on my phone and came across a seam of research that I had never happened upon before, where I learned that mothers are capable of transferring contaminants that are present in their body into their breastfeeding infant through breast milk. And I had never, this was so different to the picture that I had of this, or the picture that we carry culturally of the mother as this essentially benevolent and passive being. And it was so shocking to me. And in a way, it made me feel like there's a sort of deception at work when we think of ideas of naturalness in relation to motherhood, because it's so important to understand the ways that actually as mothers we are porous to our environments, and if we live in a toxic world, then our bodies are toxic too, and the idea that as mothers we are kind of given the responsibility by or we're handed the responsibility to make our babies safe, and that's what we want to do. There's such a strong desire for new mothers to kind of create this rim of safety, that the thought that my body was actively shunting its chemical burden into my breastfeeding infant and also into her when she was in my womb as well was so shocking, and kind of really shifted my sense of the maternal body and what's at play in motherhood, and how I understand myself in relation to the environment.
So it was almost like, in the way you describe it in a book, like a bit of a moment, a point of no return in terms of your discovery.
Really, yeah.
And kind of turning on its head your understanding of what happens in this really critical period. And as you said, that kind of sense that, we as mothers have full control over how we protect our babies. There's lots of things we can do, but suddenly there are elements outside of our control that, this discovery of what endocrine disrupting chemicals are.
Yeah,
I thought was
shall we talk a bit about that? Because I want to really celebrate Breast Cancer UK for kind of championing or bringing this issue into public awareness, because it's so important, and I think it's so it isn't understood and it isn't talked about enough. Did I see that you've got a T-shirt? You've even got the T-shirt on today.
Yes, I thought I'd dress appropriately today. It's one of our T-shirts.
But yeah, EDCs, or endocrine disrupting chemicals, are so important in the context of motherhood, because these are chemicals at large in our environment that interfere with the way that the body's hormones work. So mothers are particularly vulnerable, because so many of the processes in motherhood are driven by hormonal processes. So fertility, birth, lactation, pregnancy, they all rely on these very complex hormonal processes. And when we are brought into contact with chemicals that are potentially disrupting these processes, then it can have big effects, and effects that we're still learning about. Scientists are still learning about.
And in the book you actually pull out some of the kind of worse offenders, like the phthalates and the PFAS, otherwise known as forever chemicals. We are hearing more about forever chemicals, and I think that kind of awareness around PFAS is starting to climb. But how familiar do you really think the public is on these chemicals? And also another question really is, how do you think this gap between people understanding, being aware of it, and actually understanding that the potential risk, how is that putting us at risk? The fact that people possibly don't fully understand what these things are.
I think it's really, it was really interesting for me writing the book, because I wrote it across about 3 years, between 2021 and 2024. And through the course of that time, I think public awareness totally shifted. So when I started writing, very few people that I spoke to had heard of, unless they were working in the field, it seemed like people hadn't heard of forever chemicals, or it was rare. Whereas now I think everyone has heard of forever chemicals, and they're often in the headlines, not necessarily so much EDCs, of which the PFAS that have been studied are all endocrine disrupting chemicals. But yeah, I think it's very difficult there are so many chemicals circulating our environments today, that how can the public be expected to have an awareness of the detail and what different chemicals do and which ones are dangerous and which ones are less dangerous, and it's very frightening. So just to give an example of EDCs, there are around 100 chemicals that have been classified as EDCs under EU law, but there are tens of thousands of synthetic substances at large in our environments today that have never been tested. And these are chemicals that are present in our soils, in our seas, in our rivers, in domestic dust, in drinking water. And that's such a shocking thing to get our heads around. And it makes me, maybe we're going to talk about this more, about kind of what people can do. But my initial instinctive response to that is to feel a lot of outrage that these chemicals are being manufactured without having been tested, and they're at large in our environment, affecting people, affecting animals, without proper knowledge of their effects, and with very limited knowledge of their endocrine disrupting effects.
Yeah, and as you say, the decisions around allowing the production of these chemicals is driven by commercial gains as a priority. It's also driven by the desire to keep everything convenient. We've all got so used to convenience, and it's rather neat and tidy because they're really invisible. They might be kind of ubiquitous, but they're invisible. So it's a perfect storm, isn't it? Now, in your book, you mentioned, what can we do about it? So in your book, you actually start to talk about where is it that we might find these chemicals, just to start to bring it down to an understandable level, a practical level. So, from makeup to flame retardants in our furniture, even toxic dust that happens in our own homes. And actually, we at Breast Cancer UK, we're very much focused on that as well. And we do have information around how to reduce exposure in our homes. But I'm interested in knowing about what happened to you after this kind of burst of knowledge and how it impacted on your everyday life and your consciousness around what you did to reduce your own exposures. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm so pleased that you're offering guidance for people in their homes. And I think that's one of the... that's something to really that's something for people to really look out for, is that there are trusted organisations that are offering really good advice now about how we can make small changes in our homes. So the things that I feel very aware of PFAS. I feel very aware that the more research that's done into PFAS or forever chemicals, the more we're learning about the harm that they can have, the long-term harm. And these are persistent chemicals, so they're chemicals that remain in environments and in bodies for decades. So there are things that I've done in my home, like I'm careful about what food containers I use, what cookware I use. I avoid buying clothes that are likely to have PFAS in. But I'm also aware that ultimately these it isn't possible at a personal level and at an individual level to completely isolate ourselves from these chemicals, and nor should it be. And one of the things that I was really struck by when I interviewed researchers and experts as part of the research for this book was how clear they were about shifting responsibility away from the individual, and definitely away from mothers who are already completely overburdened with responsibility and fear and anxiety, and shifting it onto the policymakers and the lawmakers who should be keeping us safe. And so I feel like that's as much part of my action now as kind of making the decisions in my home. And I think part of the reason, and August, sorry, I'm I'm shuffling around a bit, but part of the reason why we need to emphasise kind of that the responsibility should be with the policymakers is because to make often the decisions that we make within our home require money. Often they require access to information. They require time, which I mean I have very little of, and many mothers have very little of, and so part of the change that I've made in my own life is making sure that I'm writing regularly to my MP to tell him about these issues and ask that changes are made, and we are at a real tipping point, I think, particularly in relation to forever chemicals, where the UK has fallen behind in recent years on chemical legislation, but the EU is working on a ban is working on banning forever chemicals as a whole group, and the UK should really be getting behind that. And so to put pressure, that feels like a very meaningful thing that we can do at the moment.
Yeah, I completely agree, and we are very much on board with this idea that chemicals are such a complex area. It's very difficult for the public to be able to take this on board. And for the most part, it makes sense when people completely disconnect from it, because it's not something that we can resolve on an individual level. There are things we can do in our own everyday lives to minimise exposure. But as you say, that legislative piece is so important, and that's something that we focus on. We've got a pledge that people can sign up for, a banning of EDC's pledge, but it is also very much about the UK keeping up with what's happening in the EU. Yeah. UK used to be part of the whole EU regulatory framework. They're not anymore, and as a result, as you mentioned, we're falling far behind. But the more the public becomes aware, the more powerful their voice is going to be, and through people like yourself in particular. But there is another area that has a relationship with the need for better regulation that you cover really well in your book, which is also really complex. And that's this whole idea. There's kind of three principles that you cover. You mentioned it earlier on. There's that porousness, that persistence, and the mixing. And the one, I mean, they're all very interesting topics, which, be good for you to touch on. But the one I'm most interested in is this kind of third principle, and that's the chemical cocktail principle. So maybe if you can walk us through, first of all, what you mean by the idea of porousness, persistence, and mixing, and then talk to us about what is it about the chemical cocktails that we really need regulation to look at, and why?
Yeah, thank you. So I think each of these three principles really helped me in understanding my relation to my wider environment in a different way. So the principle of porousness is about understanding the way our bodies do not exist as the discrete entities that we might sometimes wish them to be, that we are far more porous than we could ever imagine, really. And so that means that we are ingesting substances into our bodies, we're inhaling them, we sometimes absorb chemicals through our skin, like through cosmetic products. And then persistence is about the kind of the properties of some chemicals. So some chemicals have been, all substances biodegrade eventually, but some have been developed specifically to resist breaking down. And that means that they're lingering in our environments for decades, and that also means that some of the chemicals present in our bodies might be ones that are now banned, that were banned decades ago even, but that persist in our environments and won't go away for a long time to come. And then you also mentioned mixing, and so this is the idea of chemical cocktails, and it feels like a very, still quite a new and emerging area of research, but basically what it means is that scientists are realizing that, or they're finding that chemicals can work in combination, and this is frightening because of the number of chemicals now present in the wider environment. But basically, as chemicals come into contact with each other, if we're exposed to multiple chemicals at once, then they may have different levels of toxicity when combined. And this is frightening because it isn't possible for us to control those things once chemicals are already at large in our environment.
Yeah, and the problem with our current regulatory system is that, and even the gold standard, which is the EU system, tends to look at chemicals individually. So,
yes.
You mentioned the idea of having PFAS as a group ban. I mean, that's a really important achievement, because there are so many different forever chemicals. Grouping them together because of the properties that they share and will enable us to start to address this idea of cocktails. But as you say, the regulatory system looks at each chemical individually, most of which are not actually even tested. And so consequently, we're looking at the impact that has individually. But in the real world, we're not just getting exposed to one chemical here, another chemical there. That exposure is cumulative, as you say, and it's these group of chemicals in our body that will provoke the kind of responses that we have, be it changes to DNA or, things that can be programmed in early life but not manifest till later. It's not until we look at these chemicals and in their group and the impact they have on our environment as well as our bodies that we'll truly understand what the impact is. And therefore regulation, we call it the precautionary principle. Regulation needs to look at it from a precautionary approach. And at the moment, it's not how things are happening. So there's a lot of work to do in this whole, government has a huge responsibility to really take this seriously.
Yeah.
And there's something else as well. And, when I think about all these issues, it is so complex and for the public to take this on board. But there is another element that's really important, again, that links back to this. And that's the idea that everyone understands where we are in the food chain. That there is this food chain in the environment, and that we, I suppose, are at the top of the food chain as predators, and there are other predators that are quite high up at the food chain. And that actually makes us vulnerable to, in a different way, to the risks. Can you explain the concept that you cover in your book really well of biomagnification? Explain it in simple terms and how that relates to the food chain, and how that also explains different levels of exposures that happens.
Yeah, it's quite a complex idea, but basically what it means is that bigger animals need more energy. So the higher we go, so the bigger the animal, the more food that they will eat, and any toxic load in that food will be increased. So the higher we go up a food chain, the more concentrated the chemical load is in that animal's body. So Sandra Steingraber, whose book I really drew on in the writing of Mother Animal, she wrote a beautiful memoir, Having Faith, about 20 years ago, about many of these issues. She describes a moment with, I think it was her high school biology teacher, who pointed to a poster of a food chain pyramid and asked her, who's at the top of the food chain pyramid? And she said, well, it's a man. It's always a man at the top of the food chain pyramid. And he said, but no, who's really at the top? And what she realizes that the person at the top is not a man, but a breastfed infant. So actually, it's breastfed infants that are receiving the highest load in our food chains, which is really shocking. Really shocking to think that we're passing this very concentrated. I mean, depending on where we live and our lifestyle and many other factors. But yeah, potentially breastfed infants are receiving a high load.
And so, this is on the flip side. We need to think about, okay, as yourself, when you went through this as a breastfeeding mother, you were kind of absorbing all this information, but equally there's an interesting article actually that I read where you say something along the lines of we mustn't kind of undermine the ability for mothers to cope with this information, and and we're not going to become hysterical, and in fact this is necessary knowledge that isn't going to have an adverse effect, because the more the mother knows, the more she's able to understand the things that she can do. But equally, we also know that, breastfeeding has so many great qualities, both for the health of the baby and the health of the mother, that, you've got to have this balanced approach about, what decisions to take. Can you talk to us a bit more about that, this kind of idea that mothers feel empowered by knowledge?
Yeah, it's been so moving to me since the book was released earlier this year to receive messages from readers who have said that, but because I was worried, partly in writing about these issues, that it was going to be anxiety inducing for new mothers. I knew that new mothers were probably going to read this book, and I was concerned about how to write about these issues in a way that will help rather than create anxiety. And it's been very moving to receive messages from people who say that actually the book made them feel less isolated in their concern. That we do know now, there is a public awareness that our environments are polluted places, and there are a lot of headlines that are frightening. And so I guess what was important, maybe I'm moving away from the question here, but I guess what was important to me in thinking about how to write the book was how to give space for women to contact with some of the feelings that are brought up by these issues, and then to think about how to make a right response, and how to feel out who they are as mothers. And often that isn't a rational or logical answer. And it was really interesting to me when I was interviewing, there's one particular epidemiologist who I interviewed who had breastfed her daughter, knowing in full knowledge that her supervisor would have disapproved. And I think, it was so nice to speak to her, because she was just saying it's not rational. It felt like the right thing to do, and it for me it was the right thing to do, and for my daughter it was the right thing to do. And I felt quite similar, really, that breastfeeding for me was hard won. I really wanted to do it. It wasn't easy at all, and so by the time I got the hang of it, neither she nor I wanted to give it up. And the truth is also that, I think it's what we've mentioned a lot of very scary things as part of this interview, but it's also worth mentioning that the scientific consensus is that unless you live in an area of kind of unusually high exposure, the benefits of breastfeeding still outweigh the risks. And so breastfeeding is absolutely a matter of choice, and it's personal, and there are other options are also available. But the decision to breastfeed your child is likely, unless you live in an area of particularly high exposure, it's likely to be tipping risk factors a little more one way or the other.
I really love what you say about that kind of that very instinctive approach to motherhood, that really, this knowledge that this epidemiologist had was really important, but it didn't usurp her kind of inbuilt knowledge around what was best for her and her baby. And I think that's really critical as well, isn't it? There's so many things that we can't control. And I think this is just information that can help mothers understand, well, actually, there's things outside of our control. But possibly one thing your book helps with is understanding those little things that we can change and have some control over, including, for example, holding governments to account. And do you feel that by increasing this knowledge that it can, you said yourself, your initial reaction was quite visceral. It was like rage. And can we channel this rage into something practical that can really help make governments aware that they have a duty here? And how do you think we can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like without the knowledge, how can we have a voice? And without the knowledge, we are still trapped in this idea of the mother as this essentially passive, benevolent being, and we don't understand the ways that she may be harming her baby, and so we're not able to demand better and demand safer environments. So yeah, absolutely. I feel like knowledge is good, and I feel like there are people such as yourselves who are doing amazing work now. And just to mention a couple of other organisations, ChemTrust are brilliant and kind of
work closely with them.
Yeah, they're great, and FEDRA also are doing brilliant work. And these are, I guess I would also mention the Women's Environmental Network as well, who are doing projects on the ground around affordable environmental options and choices that mothers can make, parents can make. So I think to kind of go to trusted sources and then to talk with other parents and communities. And I was just thinking this morning how I'm on an allotment waiting list now for the first time in my life with a friend, and I would never be doing it on my own, but we're going to do it together. And like small things like that feel like, oh, there are changes that we can make that are about community and are about making kind of smaller, more healthy choices. Who knows if I'll manage to grow a squash, but I like the idea that I might.
But that's wonderful, isn't it? Because that's how we approach, even setting kind of chemicals aside, that's how we approach the whole idea around reducing our risk of breast cancer. It's those little things we can do in our lives, any kind of positive choices, whether it be about some lifestyle changes like exercising a little bit more, just getting a bit more active, a bit less sedentary, introducing more vegetables in our diet, those kinds of things, reducing alcohol, for example. All these little things we do have some control over. Collectively, it can have a huge impact. And it's the same with what you've just described. And I love the idea as well, you talk about this in your book, about this notion of communities of care. And so mothers helping each other. And we believe these kinds of communities are really integral because it's about sharing knowledge, encouraging and supporting each other through these little changes, not feeling isolated, and that's particularly important during motherhood. So how does connecting with others and starting that conversation, in your view, how does it help foster these very positive changes that we can make both individually but also together, such as things like lobbying governments for change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it takes us out of the kind of fight or flight that we can get into when we're faced with the kind of shocking headlines around chemicals and around particularly around forever chemicals at the moment, and I guess brings us more into local, small scale, real meaningful change. And again, I think it comes back to this kind of breaking down the idea of mothers as passive, and once we find our voice, then we find our action as well, and we're I feel like there's an amazing energy, I think, in conversations that are happening around motherhood today, and people really realizing that we need to think of mothers in different ways, and we need to be more aware of how vulnerable they are, and that they need their wider communities of support, and they are part of the wider world in ways that we haven't properly understood, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And rather than being kind of off on the side doing that thing, they're really integral to the whole world we live in. And as you say, that beautiful illustration of where it all starts, who's on top? Well, it is that breastfed baby, and the mother is part of that, It's been really lovely having the opportunity to discuss this wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. We are now going to go on to a couple of questions that I ask all our guests, which is always intriguing because we find out a little bit more about our guests this way. And that's the first question really is to understand whether you have any guilty pleasures yourself.
Oh, pleasures.
That might be surprising.
Oh, guilty pleasure for me is sugar. Always sugar. Yeah, there's a shop in the town near I live that sells a particular chocolate tiffin that I can never eat half of. So yeah, my guilty pleasure is very boring.
I mean, you always eat the whole thing, yeah?
Yeah, always the whole thing.
I think there's always a bit of reassurance when we hear about that, because we all have our guilty pleasures. Even those of us who try really hard to make the right changes, there's always going to be some things we hang on to. In terms of what you're reading, or any podcasts or films that have inspired you, can you share with our listeners anything that you think would be interesting for them?
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of reading about motherhood in the writing of this book, and there were a few books that really blew my mind, and one of those would be Maternal by Lucy Jones. A Ghost in the Throat is a novel by Doreen Negrofa. It's a wonderful novel. And also The Republic of Motherhood by Liz Berry is a beautiful small collection of poems that I always send to friends that are giving birth.
Wow, how lovely. Gosh, fascinating. We'll put those in the show notes for sure. And tell us a bit more about yourself, what your plans are. I mean, when you started this book, you were going through pregnancy. Now that's like 5 years down the track. You also talk interestingly about, life being pregnant and giving birth through COVID. But where are you now, and what are your plans for the future? Do you have anything on your bucket list that you want to get off your list?
So my daughter's just entered year 1 at school, so she's 5, and it feels like in the last year or so the horizons are lifting, and I'm looking further afield again, and I like the idea that the near future might have a bit of travel in again. It's been a few years of being quite close to home, so I like the idea of horizons slowly lifting. Yeah.
And where can we find out more about you? Where can our listeners find out more about
so
you?
the book is available and out in the world at large with all the chemicals. And I'm also on Instagram. I think it's Helen Jukes. Yeah.
And just before you go, you mentioned earlier on, some of the feedback you've had. What is some of the feedback you've had from mothers? Is it mostly mothers reading it?
Oh, that's a really good question. I thought it was going to be only mothers reading it, and actually I've had some amazing conversation with men that have read and loved it, and that's been a wonderful thing to kind of feel that fathers and grandparents are also part of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely, and I can vouch for it. I mean, I'm a mother myself, but I'm way past the stage described here. But it was a really good book, universally interesting to all of us, and really beautifully written. It's been lovely chatting, Helen. I'm really pleased we've had this opportunity, and
thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Be Well podcast, brought to you by Breast Cancer UK, a prevention charity supporting people to build healthy, lifelong habits and reduce their risk of developing breast cancer. You can start your personal prevention journey right now by taking our prevention quiz. Just click on the link in the show notes.